Koji Takamura flinched as the truck lurched to a stop, its brakes squealing in protest against the biting Colorado wind. The rear gate clanged open. "Out!" barked a voice in accented English. Koji didn't move at first. The cold struck him harder than the command. Then the barrel of a rifle tapped his shoulder, not violently but firmly enough to snap him into motion. He stepped down, his boots crunching into snow-dusted gravel, his balance unsteady from hours of rattling transport. His wrists were loosely bound with a rope tied more for symbolism than restraint. Around him, the other Japanese soldiers followed silently, faces hollow and closed off. No one spoke. Silence was a shield. Beyond the gates, Camp Millstone waited like a factory made of fences. The wire ran high and tight, coiled at the top like barbed crowns. Guard towers marked the perimeter, their shadows long under the gray winter light. Behind them, a forest of black pines stood still, watching. Koji's gaze lingered on those trees for a second longer than necessary. They looked more like sentries than shelter. From the opposite side of the yard, U.S. Army Captain Russell Monroe stood beside the guardhouse with his arms folded tightly across his chest. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, tracked every step of the prisoners. He didn't speak, didn't nod, just studied. His uniform was immaculate, not a crease out of place. A silver wristwatch gleamed briefly beneath his sleeve cuff. He had read the dossiers, signed the intake orders, and memorized the camp's new procedures. He had also buried his cousin, Walter, who died on the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor. Monroe didn't allow that memory to shape his duty, but it hovered, always. He didn't hate the men arriving in chains, but he didn't feel anything close to trust either. The war was still raging across oceans and skies. It wasn't over. Not for them. Not for him. The guards weren't as restrained. "New shipment of rice ghosts," muttered one under his breath, just loud enough for his buddy to hear. They both chuckled, not maliciously but casually, like boys teasing shadows in the dark. Another soldier, a young redhead named Coulter, smirked as he leaned against the mess hall doorway. "Bet they've never seen a boiled potato before," he said. Koji didn't understand the words, but he saw the expressions, the sideways looks, the way they handled the rifles, not with urgency but with superiority. These weren't guards, they were zookeepers, and he was being led into a foreign enclosure. Inside the processing tent, the prisoners were handed their assigned numbers, thin wool blankets, and trays of food. The mess hall smelled faintly of cabbage, metal, and pine soap. Koji accepted his tray in silence. A bowl of thin white stew sat beside 2 slices of dense bread and something else. 3 small, round, white lumps had been placed in the upper corner of his tray. They were chalky, dry-looking, and identical. Koji stared at them with narrowed eyes. He leaned slightly toward the soldier beside him, Private Daigo, a rail-thin man from Ibaraki who'd once been a rice farmer. "What are these?" Koji whispered. Daigo sniffed one, then gently tapped it against the tray. It made a dull click. "Stones," he murmured, "to test our teeth." Koji's mouth stayed shut. Suspicion coiled in his stomach. The white lumps looked harmless, but in a place like this, harmless was dangerous. The last thing you trusted in enemy hands was kindness. Their officers had drilled that into them. Americans will smile before they strike. Their gifts are poison with a ribbon. He looked up. A guard at the far end of the room watched the prisoners eat, leaning on his rifle like it was a walking stick. He yawned. Koji pushed the bowl aside. That night, in the dim bunkhouse, Koji lay on his back staring at the ceiling slats, hearing the wind scratch faintly at the corners of the building. The blanket was heavy and scratchy, the cot narrow. All around him, men shifted restlessly, the occasional cough breaking the silence. His thoughts drifted back to the tray. The soup had been tolerable, the bread dense but edible, but the white objects haunted him. Why were they there? What were they meant to be? A soft rustle to his left. Dago sat up and whispered, "You think they watch how we eat? What we touch?" Koji turned toward him slightly. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe they wait to see who breaks first." Daigo didn't respond. Outside, a dog barked, short, sharp, then silence. Koji closed his eyes, but the image of the white lumps on the tray remained behind his eyelids. The guards laughed like they were harmless. The camp gave them without explanation. The food was soft, the blankets warm, but he felt no comfort. "Everything here looks soft, but that makes it more dangerous," he muttered. The marshmallows appeared without warning. They sat on the metal trays in rows, soft, pale cylinders nestled beside cabbage rolls and gray soup, their appearance more suspicious than inviting. No guard explained what they were, no officer translated, and in a place where suspicion had become a survival instinct, the absence of clarity was a threat. Sergeant Goro Nishida stared at the unfamiliar objects with narrowed eyes. He had spent years in the imperial kitchens, boiling rice under mortar fire, gutting fish on cargo decks in seas so rough the knives slid off cutting boards. But this, whatever it was, made no sense. He tapped one gently with the handle of his spoon. It bounced slightly, light as foam. No scent, no texture he recognized. He turned it over with deliberate slowness. Beside him, Private Koji Takamura didn't touch his tray. He was watching the guards, trying to read the subtle clues in their posture. Were they amused? Were they watching too closely? His heart ticked like a slow metronome, careful and rehearsed. A test, he thought. This has to be a test. At the end of the table, a younger prisoner murmured something about eggs gone bad. Another guessed chalk. Goro remained silent, fingers tightening around the edge of the tray. He had once seen sulfur pellets that looked like this, clean, harmless, deadly when handled wrong. "What do you think it is?" Koji asked quietly, barely tilting his head. Goro didn't answer right away. Then, in a tone so dry it barely registered as speech, he said, "Something soft, pretending to be sweet." Or something sweet, pretending to be soft. 2 bunks away, someone dared to press a marshmallow to his nose and sniffed cautiously, then coughed and dropped it. "They smell like soap," he muttered. A silence followed. No one ate them. Thousands of miles away, in an office lined with dusty radiators and steel desks, Red Cross liaison, Martin Keating squinted at a translated report. "Noted difficulty accepting Western food textures," it read. "Resistance particularly strong toward unfamiliar sweets and dairy items." He underlined the phrase twice and placed the sheet on a growing pile. "They're not used to this stuff," Keating said aloud. Across the room, Lieutenant David Grigsby looked up from his typewriter. "So?" Grigsby asked, shrugging. "So, it matters. They're rejecting what we serve. Every meal becomes a statement." Keating rubbed the bridge of his nose. "It's not just nutrition. It's meaning. They think we're mocking them." Grigsby made a dismissive sound. "They're prisoners, Martin. Not hotel guests. If they can eat field rations on jungle patrol, they can eat a few sweets back at Camp Millstone." Lieutenant Peter Halverson jotted notes in his small green ledger, unaware of the quiet brewing tension. His handwriting was tight, focused. Offer simple treats. Avoid excessive force. Let curiosity open minds. That morning, he had overseen the addition of marshmallows to the holiday trays, part of a small cultural outreach approved by his superior officers. To him, it was a gesture of harmless generosity. Marshmallows, after all, were comforting. Harmless. A neutral symbol of winter celebrations. But Halverson had made one quiet mistake. He never thought to explain them. He assumed, as many do, that kindness speaks for itself. Back in the mess barracks, Goro tucked 2 of the strange items into his coat pocket. The rest remained untouched on every tray in the room. When the guards came to collect leftovers, their expression shifted from curiosity to visible disappointment. "Not even one bite?" one guard muttered. Another laughed. "Guess they're not into dessert." Maybe they like it raw, and wriggling Koji's eyes narrowed slightly at the insult, but he said nothing. Words here traveled too far and too fast. That night, as wind rattled the thin wooden barracks and frost-painted spiderwebs across the window panes, Goro sat near the foot of his bunk with the marshmallows on a tin plate. Several men gathered in silence. Sadao Hiraga leaned in. "Maybe it melts." "Maybe it's medicine," he whispered. Koji said, "Or bait." "They want us to break a rule." "They don't need poison," Goro muttered. "They need doubt." "That's how you weaken a wall, make the bricks question the mortar." He reached for the stove, a potbelly cast-iron thing that hissed faintly with the slow burn of pine logs. Goro hesitated. He placed the marshmallow on the edge of a metal rod and held it close to the flame. Nothing happened for a moment. Then it began to puff. A slow hiss, followed by the bloom of brown at its edge. The smell came next, faint, sugary, warm, unmistakably sweet. And yet the effect was panic. One of the prisoners leapt backward. Another grabbed a blanket, shouting. A third dashed for water. In the flurry of motion, the marshmallow dropped from the rod and struck the fire grate, flaring with sudden heat and blackening. The door burst open. A guard's flashlight swept the room like a searchlight. "What the hell's going on?" he barked. No one spoke. No one could explain. The next day, Goro sat through questioning by Lieutenant Halverson, who looked genuinely perplexed. "You thought it might be sulfur?" he asked. "We didn't know what it was," Goro replied, calm but tired. No one said. It came from nowhere. Halverson opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. The misunderstanding hung between them like smoke. Back in his office, Halverson scribbled a note for his superiors. Observation: the prisoners do not respond well to unintroduced cultural items. Marshmallows in particular caused confusion and panic. Recommend future editions be labeled and explained. He paused, then added, "Even small gestures can become threats when not translated." The marshmallow hit the stove with a quiet thunk. For a moment, nothing happened. Private Sadao Hiraga narrowed his eyes, peering through the iron grate as the strange white lump sat motionless on the blackened metal plate. The stove crackled faintly, casting orange light across the barracks wall. Then, with a soft hiss, the object began to swell. It puffed outward like a breathing creature, its skin blistering as steam burst from its center. The sugary scent was the final warning. Within seconds, the marshmallow caught fire, sending thin tendrils of caramelized smoke curling toward the ceiling. "What is that?" hissed a voice behind him. "Get it out," barked another as someone reached for a boot to stomp the flame. But it was too late. The marshmallow had ignited like dry kindling, emitting a sweet but oddly chemical smell as it bubbled and blackened. The fire was small, barely larger than a fist, but in the tense atmosphere of Barracks 4, it might as well have been a grenade. Sadao jumped back, knocking over his tin cup. It clattered loudly onto the wooden floor. The sound startled the others into motion. Private Junmori threw a wool blanket over the stove, hoping to smother the flame. The fabric caught the heat and released a burst of ash into the air. Goro Nishida, ever calm under pressure, grabbed a metal pail from beneath the wash basin and dumped water onto the stove. Steam roared upward. The room hissed like a furnace. At that exact moment, a guard outside spotted the sudden flash through the frosted window. A loud whistle blew from the tower, followed by the thud of boots on packed snow. "Down! Everyone down!" someone shouted as the barracks door burst open. A blinding flashlight beam cut across the smoky room, slicing through the panic. Behind it stood Sergeant Miller, his rifle aimed squarely at the stove. His breath steamed in the cold air behind him. "Step away!" "Hands where I can see them." The prisoners froze. Koji Takamura, seated near the far wall, raised his hands slowly. His mind raced, not with fear, but with shame. The situation had spiraled out of control so quickly, and yet all they'd done was investigate a harmless-looking item they didn't understand. The guards wouldn't care. They rarely did. Everything unfamiliar was a threat in this place. Sergeant Miller scanned the room, nostrils flaring. "Who started it?" he demanded. No one spoke. The smoke, now tinged with the faint aroma of burned sugar, wafted toward him. The blanket over the stove was scorched at the edges but no longer burning. Miller stepped forward, kicked the blanket aside with his boot, and leaned down to inspect the remnants. The marshmallow had collapsed into a puddle of charred syrup, its once puffy form reduced to sticky black crust. Miller's expression shifted, just slightly, but not toward understanding. "Contraband," he muttered. "Someone smuggled flammables in. That's sabotage." Koji opened his mouth to protest, but stopped. He saw the guard's grip tighten on the rifle, not loosen. Arguing wouldn't fix this. It would only dig the hole deeper. The barracks was silent now, except for the soft wheeze of the stove and the crackle of something unburnt still roasting beneath the grate. Miller turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. "Command will be notified. You'll all be on report." And then he was gone. The door slammed shut behind him, cutting off the light. For a long moment, no one moved. It was Sadao who finally spoke, his voice low, filled with bitter regret. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. I just thought maybe it was some kind of explosive or chemical block." Goro, seated beside him, shook his head slowly. "We weren't wrong to be cautious," he said. "It acted like no food I've ever seen." Koji exhaled quietly. His breath clouded in front of him. "They say we tampered with contraband," he said, voice measured. "But no one told us what it was." He walked toward the stove and looked at the charred mass inside. The smell was almost pleasant, sweet, like something from a childhood memory he'd never had. It clashed violently with the gray concrete, the iron bars, and the tension that still buzzed in the air like static. The next morning, the consequences fell hard and fast. Rations for the entire barracks were suspended for 3 days. Guards were given new instructions to inspect every item handed to POWs, no matter how mundane. Lieutenant Halverson received a memo titled Food-Based Manipulation Risk Protocol, warning that soft goods could be repurposed as distraction devices or ignition tools. No further cultural treats were to be distributed until further review. In the mess hall, whispers passed from bunk to bunk. Some prisoners believed the Americans had tried to poison them and now punished them for resisting. Others thought it had been a test, one they'd failed. Most simply sat in silence, hunger sharpening their thoughts into suspicion. Koji kept replaying the moment in his head. The soft hiss, the smell, the guard's voice raised in anger, and the accusing looks afterward. He didn't blame Sadao. He blamed the gap between cultures, so wide, so unspoken, it swallowed even a harmless piece of sugar. That night the stove sat cold. No one dared touch it. Koji sat beside it anyway, staring into its iron mouth like it might answer back. He could still smell the sweet residue clinging to the sides. "They thought we were burning weapons," he said finally, his voice barely more than a breath. "But we were just burning doubt." The marshmallow incident had barely settled when the orders came down. At 0600 hours, under a sky the color of faded ash, Major Wilton Hargrove summoned the inner circle of Camp Millstone's command staff. The report from Barracks 4 had used the phrase unauthorized combustion, which alarmed headquarters more than it should have. There was no explosion, no property damage, but the smell of burnt sugar had carried an unfamiliar implication. Hargrove, a rigid man with clipped gray hair and an unforgiving jawline, had never trusted soft approaches. "You give these men sweets," he muttered. "They'll think you're hiding poison." By 0700, Lieutenant Charles Granger, a young but shrewd intelligence officer from the 82nd Psychological Operations Unit, was driven in from Fort Tyler. He had read the summary twice in the Jeep. A marshmallow mistaken for a chemical weapon. A stove used to test it. Panic. Flames. Misunderstanding. But misunderstanding, in wartime, often smelled like sabotage. Granger's boots echoed as he entered the makeshift interrogation room, an old mess hall repurposed with minimal effort. Fluorescent lights buzzed above. 3 chairs had been arranged in a triangle, with Koji Takamura seated alone. His wrists weren't bound, but his posture was stiff, his eyes cautious, as if still translating every gesture into something survivable. Granger didn't sit. Instead, he placed a glass jar on the table. Inside it, carefully preserved, was a single marshmallow. "Tell me," Granger began, his voice calm but distant. "What does this mean to you?" Koji didn't answer at first. He stared at the jar, then at the man, then back again. The silence stretched. Behind the mirror-paneled wall, Hargrove and Monroe observed, arms folded, faces unreadable. "I thought it was chemical," Koji finally said, his voice quiet but deliberate. Granger's expression didn't change, but he slowly walked around the table. "Why?" he asked. "It looked like sulfur." "It burned too easily," Koji replied. "It came with no explanation." Granger tapped the glass. "Did you think it was sabotage from us?" "A weapon?" Koji hesitated. "I thought it was a trick. To test us. To confuse us." Granger nodded, slowly, like a man reading between lines only he could see. He jotted a note. "Perception gap remains wider than estimated." "Did you instruct others to keep them? Stockpile them? Use them?" "No," Koji said. "Most of us threw them away." From behind the mirror, Monroe shifted uncomfortably. He didn't like interrogations, but he understood the need. Still, something in Koji's face, neither fear nor defiance, just measured shame, unsettled him. Granger turned toward a second chair where Goro Nishida had been waiting. The sergeant had been a field cook before his capture, and his presence in the mess hall was already marked with suspicion. "You were once a cook," Granger said, not asking. "What did you think it was?" "Chalk," Goro answered, "or cleaning powder." "Why would we serve that with stew?" Goro's eyes narrowed slightly. "To see what we would do." Granger inhaled sharply through his nose. The assumption, though baseless, revealed a deeper fracture. To the prisoners, even kindness could be a mask. His pen moved again across the notebook. Cultural indoctrination creating conditioned suspicion. Private Sadao Hiraga was next. His voice was less certain, his answers clipped. "I threw it in the stove to test it," he admitted. "I thought it would melt. Or turn black. But it caught fire," Granger said. "Yes." "Do you understand now that it was just sugar?" Sadao nodded. "Now, yes." But understanding, Granger knew, came too late. The report was already being drafted. There was no precedent in military handbooks for marshmallow-based confusion, and so the safest label was psychological risk. Granger signed the form that afternoon. Meanwhile, in the administrative office, Halverson was summoned. Hargrove barely looked at him. "You were told to build morale," the major said coldly, "not cause a security breach." Halverson fumbled with his folder. "Sir, I believed." "Bread, fruit, soup," Hargrove snapped. "No more improvisation." "Yes, sir." Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and old ash from the stove incident. In the yard, Koji walked alone, head bowed. Others avoided his eyes, not out of anger, but embarrassment. He'd been pulled from the barracks, questioned under lights, made to explain something he had never known existed. Later, in the quiet of his bunk, he wrote a single line in his notebook, just beneath the stitched binding. "Even when you're not guilty," Koji thought, "they still need someone to blame for the confusion." Camp Millstone, winter 1944. The cup trembled slightly in Renjiro Asai's hands as he returned to the long bench inside Barracks 2. The cocoa inside was already beginning to form a thin skin, steam curling upward in gentle spirals. The stove in the center of the room hissed and popped, the only sound besides the muffled wind pressing against the wooden walls of the barracks. Most of the men stared at their drinks in silence, skeptical of the unexpected warmth offered to them on such a bitter evening. Renjiro sat cross-legged on the floor, his boots tucked beneath the edge of his blanket. He was small and wiry, with sharp eyes and a habit of squinting as if trying to see through people. He had grown up scavenging food from riverbanks during the lean years, long before the war. Hunger had taught him to be cautious, but also quick. Tonight, that same hunger gnawed at him. His eyes locked on the strange, soft lumps floating atop the cocoa. White and puffy, they looked nearly identical to the so-called stones from weeks ago, the same ones that caused the panic, the fire, the punishment. No one had touched them since. No one wanted to be the first fool again. Renjiro reached out anyway. "Wait," Koji murmured, his voice low but edged. He sat against the far wall, hands wrapped tightly around his own tin cup. His gaze was fixed not on Renjiro, but on the marshmallows, those deceptively innocent shapes melting slowly into the surface of the drink. Renjiro froze halfway, fingers hovering. But then he moved. His thumb and forefinger plucked one from the rim of the cup. It squished slightly, resisting just a little before giving way. He brought it to his lips. For a breath, he hesitated. Then, quietly, without ceremony, he bit. It melted instantly. His jaw paused mid-chew. The texture evaporated on his tongue, soft and sweet like nothing he'd ever tasted. His brow furrowed in confusion. "It's sugar," he whispered so softly it could have been a thought. The room froze. 10 men stared. Koji looked up sharply. Even Goro, hunched near the stove, sharpening a wooden spoon against the floor, stopped mid-motion. No one spoke. Renjiro glanced around, unsure if he'd made a terrible mistake or uncovered a secret. But nothing happened. No pain, no sickness, only warmth spreading through his cheeks. Koji slowly stood. The wooden floor creaked beneath his steps as he crossed the room. He sat beside Renjiro and looked at the cocoa. The white bits had half melted now, sagging into the drink like soft clouds. Koji dipped a finger, brought it to his lips, and tasted. His eyes didn't widen. His shoulders didn't move. But his breath caught, barely, and that was enough. Goro rose next, his movements deliberate and skeptical. The old cook crouched by the cup, sniffed, pinched a piece of the marshmallow and tested it against his tongue like it was lye. His face twitched. "Huh," Goro said under his breath. One by one, the others approached. Not with smiles, but with the same look they gave to a new officer or a different rifle. Wary, assessing, ready to retreat. Fingers reached out. Tin cups were raised. Marshmallows were tasted. The silence didn't break, but something inside it shifted. Across the room, Sergeant Tadao Minami leaned against his bunk, arms crossed. "So," he muttered, "they give us poison once and candy the next." Koji didn't look up. "Or they gave us candy both times. We just didn't know how to taste it." Goro scoffed. "Sweetness without explanation is just another weapon," he muttered. But he took another sip all the same. Outside, the snow had begun again, thick flakes landing on the barracks windows, muffling the sounds from the watchtowers. Inside, heat from the stove mingled with the soft scent of cocoa and melting sugar. No one cheered. No one thanked the guards. But the silence grew less sharp. Later that night, as most of the men settled into their bunks, Koji sat on the edge of his straw mat, legs drawn up to his chest. He held the empty cocoa cup in one hand, his thumb tracing its rim. Renjiro lay curled nearby, his blanket wrapped tightly around him. "Do you think they planned it?" he asked drowsily. "To make us eat it again?" Koji shook his head. "I think they didn't plan anything," he said. "Just a mistake." He looked toward the window, where the frost patterns webbed like veins across the glass. "It is strange," Koji whispered later, "how sweetness can survive in a place like this." The orders came down like snowfall, quiet, final, and too late to argue with. Camp Millstone had been notified of upcoming transfers. A dull paper memo, stamped in red and folded twice, landed on Captain Russell Monroe's desk just after morning inspection. Some prisoners would be repatriated under pending Geneva arrangements. Others reassigned to holding camps in Texas or Wyoming for bureaucratic consolidation. No reasons were given. None were ever needed. Captain Monroe stared at the names. Koji Takamura was on the list, one of the few prisoners whose name he recognized without checking a manifest. The memory of that white stone incident months ago hadn't left him. It hovered like frostbite, painful only when touched, but always there. Something gnawed at him. Monroe set aside the transfer memo and walked to the welfare office, where Lieutenant Halverson had just finished organizing storage crates of cultural integration logs, files destined for a government basement or a forgotten archive. "I want a full incident summary," Monroe said. His voice was flat, but his eyes carried weight. Halverson blinked. "Sir." "Regarding the food misunderstanding," Monroe clarified, "the Marshmallow episode. I want it documented before these men disappear into new camps." Halverson, still a young officer more idealist than soldier, nodded and opened a drawer stuffed with loosely bound papers, reports, and memos. He flipped through pages rapidly, sweat forming at his temple despite the cold. "It's here somewhere." "I noted it in the winter reports. Not in the disciplinary log, it wasn't formal." He finally pulled out a sheaf of thin, typed pages. At the very back, buried in the appendix of routine morale reports and meal summaries, was a section labeled Addendum C, Cultural Incidents and Dietary Adjustments. Halverson hesitated before handing it over. "I don't think anyone read this, sir." "I filed it, but command never asked." Monroe took the document and read silently. "Unintentional cultural incident regarding marshmallows triggered suspicion and fear. Now resolved. Recommend future integration through cautious, explained introduction of foreign items." That was it. One paragraph. No follow-up. No change in protocol. No formal recommendations passed up the chain. "They never saw this?" Monroe asked. Halverson shook his head. "I sent it with the usual quarterly batch. No one asked about it." Monroe folded the page slowly, then slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket without a word. He left the welfare office and stepped out into the yard, where snow had returned in soft, dry flakes. The pine trees surrounding the wire fences loomed gray against the fading light, and the compound echoed faintly with the clatter of boots, distant shouts, and the buzz of an idling transport truck. Near the edge of the barracks, he saw Koji sitting cross-legged on a wooden crate, a folding knife in hand. The prisoner's posture was calm but focused, his brows drawn in quiet precision. In his lap rested a palm-sized block of soft pine, nearly finished. Monroe approached, boots crunching lightly over gravel, and watched without speaking. The carving was simple. No elaborate design, just a small, smoothed shape like a square with softly curved edges. Not quite a box, not quite a stone. It had a pillowy roundness to it. Monroe crouched beside him. "What is it?" Koji didn't look up at first. He turned the wood gently in his fingers, brushing away the fine dust from its edges. His hands were cracked, his knuckles red from cold. Finally, he glanced up, his voice low but clear. "A soft stone," he said. "One that didn't break my teeth." Monroe stared at the carving, then back at Koji's face. For a second, neither spoke. A gust of wind passed through the fence line, rattling the frozen flag. Somewhere across the yard, a sergeant yelled about packing procedures. Koji went back to carving. Monroe stood slowly. He felt the weight of the paper inside his coat like a stone of its own, silent, damning, and invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. He turned to walk away, unsure what would come of it, unsure if anyone would ever read what Halverson wrote, or if the lesson would remain buried in a file cabinet labeled Miscellaneous Welfare. But he knew one thing. Later, when Monroe wrote his final journal entry from Camp Millstone before reassignment, he stared out the window of his quarters and remembered that quiet moment in the snow. Sometimes, Monroe later wrote in his journal, the smallest misunderstanding can start a war or end one. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of culture shock, discovery, and the unexpected kindness found in simple moments. Its purpose is to entertain while reminding viewers that curiosity and openness can turn confusion into connection, even between former enemies.